So what we understand about the arbitrage? Arbitrage we discussed in the previous session. Actually, arbitrage means we are purchasing good from a cheaper market and sell it to the highest market, right? So how this is going to be in international finance based on the parity condition or purchasing power parity condition. Now, assuming that when compared to the, when we considering the wheat price, right? Now, forget about the exchange rate. We consider wheat price. No, not to forget the exchange rate, but considering the exchange rate and everything, we identify that, right? The wheat, we take the same example, right? Wheat price in Sri Lanka, we can get as rupee 85. Okay. And the wheat price in US, we take it as dollar 0.75. Right. Now, assuming that the spot exchange between Sri Lankan rupee into dollar, like we say rupees 130 per dollar. Dollar ekata rupiah 130. Okay. If wheat price in Sri Lanka 85, and how we are going to calculate the wheat price in Sri Lanka based on US dollar price? Now, assuming that the quality of the wheat are same, right? Medan assume karanna quality එක සමානයි, transportation cost, it is that is not significant amount, right? That's what we are considering by the purchasing power parity. And නිකන් අපි assume කරමු quality එක සමානයි සහ transport cost එක ලොකු amount එකක් යන්නේ නැහැ මේ රටවල් දෙක අතර බාණ්ඩ හොමාරු වෙන්න. Based on that assumption, how we can get the wheat price? How we can get the wheat price in Sri Lanka in terms of US dollar? Wheat price එක ලංකාවේ sorry US dollar term එකකින් ගියොත් US dollar එක Sri Lankan rupee වලින් කතා කරොත්, right? So we get wheat price in US in terms of Sri Lankan rupee, we get how much? Rupees? That is dollar 0.75 into rupees 130. How much we are getting? We will get it as, let me calculate, 2.75, it is 97, that is rupees 97.5, that is 97.50. Now, if you are trying to similarize the wheat price in between Sri Lanka and US by using the exchange rate, right? What we identify is, now US here in rupee, right? Now what we can see is the wheat price in Sri Lanka is 85. If we consider the wheat price in US in terms of Sri Lankan rupee, by considering the today's exchange rate or spot rate, we identify that now in USA, wheat price is getting rupees 97.50 cents. Now, which market having lowest wheat price if we're going to express the wheat price in same currency or common currency? Now, Sri Lankan market, wheat price are cheaper than US wheat price, isn't it? ලංකාවේ රුපියල් 85කට ගන්න පුළුවන් wheat price, wheat පාම්පිටි කිලෝ එක ඇමරිකාව වෙනවා රුපියල් 97.50. රටවල් දෙකම එකම currency එකෙන් අපි express කරමු. Right? So now what we can see is there is no parity condition. If it is a parity condition, the spot rate has to be, right? Spot rate has to be rupees into dollar. අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම spot rate එක වෙන්න ඕනේ මොකද්ද? Right? රුපියල් 85 බෙදන්න ඕනේ. Rupees 85 should be divided by dollar 0.75. It is equal how much? should be equal, sorry, 85 divided by 0.75, it should be equal 113 per dollar. Rupees, sorry. හරි නේද 85 75 බෙදුවාම රුපියල් 113.34 per dollar. Right? So that should be the exchange rate. Has to be there, but exchange rate is there, rupees 130 per dollar. That is Sri Lankan rupee getting depreciate against dollar when compared to the purchasing power parity exchange rate. Purchasing power parity එකට අනුව තියෙන ඕන exchange rate එකත් එක්ක බැලුවොත් ලංකාවේ රුපියල depreciate වෙලා තියෙන්නේ. As a result of that, right? As a result of that, now US consumer can take Sri Lankan wheat at a cheapest price. Right? US customer කෙනෙකුට ලංකාවේ wheat ගන්න පුළුවන් අඩුවෙන් ඇමරිකාවේ wheat කිලෝ එකකට ගෙවනවට වඩා. Now we can see that Sri Lankan wheat prices are getting lower than US wheat price when we are going to express in terms of Sri Lankan rupee value. So what we can see in here, what we can see in here, we can see that now Sri Lankan wheat demand from US market increase. Sri Lankan wheat demand at the US market. Why? Sri Lankan rupee getting Sri Lankan wheat getting cheaper. Right? So then the demand for wheat in Sri Lanka increase. Then we can see the supply of dollar increase in Sri Lanka also, right? We forgot about the demand, supply and things, right? So what we can see in wheat price, right? Wheat demand in Sri Lanka increase. As a result of that, Sri Lankan wheat price, wheat price increase. Demand on the price, then finally, the Sri Lankan wheat price are getting equal in US wheat price in terms of Sri Lankan rupee. Right? So wheat demand from US market increases. As a result of that, in Sri Lankan market, wheat prices getting increases. Right? Wheat prices increase. Right? Then ultimately, if this process continue, දිගටම ලංකාවෙන් පාම්පිටි මිලදී ගන්න US market එක එනවා කියලා කියන්නේ Sri Lankan demand wheat වලට තියෙන demand එක වැඩි, ඒ අනුව wheat price එක වැඩි වෙනවා. Finally, Sri Lankan wheat price getting equal US wheat price, right? If it is expressed in terms of Sri Lankan rupee. Right? So this is the process we call law of one price. මේකට තමයි අපි කියන්නේ law of one price කියලා. Okay? So arbitrage means we purchasing from Sri Lankan market and selling to the highest market. That we are purchasing wheat from Sri Lankan market where wheat price is cheap and try to sell it to the US market. As a result of buying wheat from Sri Lankan market, the demand for wheat increase in Sri Lankan market, then the price of wheat increase in Sri Lankan market. When we try to sell wheat to US market, then supply of wheat in US market increase. As a result of that, the price level in US market getting decrease. Then the two price levels in wheat in both countries getting equalized when we are trying to express in the common currency platform. This is what we called as law of one price. Right? Then the arbitrage continue like our example. Our example එකට අනුව ලංකාවේ wheat price එක අඩුයි USA wheat price එකට වඩා. එහෙම වුණාම මොකෝ වෙන්නේ? ලංකාවෙන් පිටි මිලදී අරගෙන US market එකට මිනිස්සු විකුණනවා. So that is the arbitrage. If that process continue, Sri Lankan market wheat demand increase. As a result of that, wheat price increase. Then the supply of wheat in US market increase. As a result of that, the price level in US market wheat getting increase. then both market getting equalized with the wheat price in terms of common currency, like Sri Lankan rupee, wheat price in Sri Lanka and USA, then the law of one price getting there. So law of one price is like that. ඔකට තමයි අපි law of one price කියලා කියන්නේ. In the absence of market imperfection, risk-adjusted expected return of financial assets in different markets should be equal. So market imperfection means, that is, we know some countries have one particular resources and other countries have no particular resources. As a result of that, the countries rich with the resources, they try to export their product to the countries which are not rich with that particular resources, like oil. Right? So in the absence of this kind of market imperfection and things, we can see the arbitrage can be carried out. But arbitrage is a very short-term process, because we identify right now when there is a buying and selling of the product from cheaper market to the expensive market, ultimately both market prices getting equal due to the high demand and high supply. Then that is, we call it as law of one price. So that is why purchasing power parity emphasize. Right? ඔක තමයි purchasing power parity emphasize කරන්නේ. Price differences has to be adjusted with exchange rate. Right? Now, based on our example, what we see, the price differences is there and exchange rate is not adjusted based on the price differences. As a result of that, wheat price in Sri Lanka are getting lower than wheat price in US market. Right? Finally, what we can see is, either we can see the price differences of wheat can be eliminated, or exchange rate has to be appreciated or depreciate according to the inflation differences. So that is what we identified as purchasing power parity. And along with the purchasing power parity, I explain you how arbitrage can be occurred, as well as how law of one price getting performed. Right? So I believe that you understand the concept behind purchasing power parity. That is, exchange rate has to be adjusted with the inflation differences between two countries. Okay. Right. So you can see another example with the arbitrage, and you can work it out. So you can work out this exercise and find out how arbitrage can be occurred and how prices are getting equalized when the arbitrage process continue, like what we discussed as wheat example. Right. So moving on with the another example, you can see. Okay. Right. So please refer the examples and get to know about the price arbitrage concepts. Sorry, arbitrage concept with law of one price. Now, our next question is purchasing power parity realistic? Right? If you refer the section empirical evidence in page number 149 and 151 in your recommended textbook, you also having the similar question. Is purchasing power parity realistic? That means, can we adjust the exchange rate based on the inflation differences, as what we identified through this session? අපි මේ session එකේ අඳුරගත්ත විදිහටම inflation differences අනුව exchange rate adjust වෙනවද? That is the question it asks. Is purchasing power parity realistic? But you can see there are two common effects we can identify. Right? These effects are causing to deviate purchasing power parity approach conditions. මේ effect දෙක නිසා actually purchasing power parity theory එක realistic නෑ. So we identify them as compounding effects and no substitute for traded goods. Okay. So compounding effect mean, right? So purchasing power parity says that exchange rate movement should be compelled with inflation differences. But if you look at the given example in your textbook also, the Venezuela inflation rate is 5% above the US inflation rate. يعني Venezuela inflation rate එක 105කින් වැඩි US inflation rate එකට වඩා. So according to the PPP theory, it suggests that the Venezuela currency, that is Venezuela Bolivia, has to be depreciated by 5% against US dollar. So now we know that is a theoretical approach. But the government in Venezuela imposed trade barriers against US exports. එතකොට මේකේ මොකෝ උනේ? Venezuela price level එක වැඩි වෙච්ච ගමන් මොකෝ වෙන්නේ? There is a high demand for US particular product. Why? Now US goods are getting cheaper to Venezuelan people. Now what Venezuela government do is, Venezuela government put trade barriers for US export. Now Venezuelan people are not allowed to consume US goods which are cheaper than Venezuelan goods. Okay, so this kind of things may not be depreciate the home currency against foreign currency. ඒතකොට මේ වගේ වෙලාවක home currency එක depreciate වෙන්නේ නැහැ foreign currency එකත් එක්ක inflation level එක home currency එකේ වැඩි වෙච්ච වෙලාවට. Based on that particular occasion, like the government intervention into the trade, like imposing import tariff or imposing trade barriers, like what Venezuela government do, the exchange rate will not be adjusted as suggested by the purchasing power parity when there is a inflation differences between two countries. That is we call compounding effect, right? Other effect we call no substitute for traded goods. ඊළඟ එක තමයි traded goods වලට trade no substitute. Now for an example, so idea behind the PPP theory, that means purchasing power parity theory, is as soon as the price become relatively higher in one country, consumer in other countries will stop buying that imported goods and shift to the other substitute goods. Now for an example, if Sri Lankan product or Sri Lankan price levels are getting relatively high than US goods and services, right? Normally what we can see is there are two consequences happen. That is the important goods from US market getting increased, as well as the Sri Lankan export goods getting lower. ලංකාවේ බඩුවල මිල වැඩි වෙච්ච ගමන් ලංකාවේ export වලට තියෙන demand එක අඩු වෙනවා. But the export demand is not getting that much decline. ඒ බලාපොරොත්තු වෙච්ච මට්ටමටම export demand එක අඩු වෙන්නේ if US markets are not ready to shift their buying pattern to another particular substitute. කියන්නේ ලංකාවෙන් මිලදී ගත්ත export goods වලට US market එක හුරු වෙලා ඉන්නවා නම් ලංකාවේ මිල වැඩි වෙච්ච ගමන්ම අපේ export වලට තියෙන demand එක අඩු වෙන්නේ නැහැ. Why? Because the US market consumers do not have any close substitute for our Sri Lankan export goods. Okay, therefore there is no that much of decreasing in export goods as purchasing power parity emphasize. Now if you reconsider the given example in Venezuela, now Venezuela inflation rate is higher, 5% higher than US inflation rate. If US consumers do not find substitute good for a Venezuelan goods, they may still continue to buy the Venezuelan good even their price levels are high. Right? Then the Bolivia, that means the Venezuelan currency, may not be depreciated as expected according to the PPP theory. Okay, so that is two occasions where we cannot see purchasing power parity as realistic. Right? But that doesn't mean that PP is not invalid theory. Right? But PP is valid because we identify through our example also exchange rate has to be facilitated to eliminate the price differences between two countries. අපි එක පෙන්නුවානේ අර එක්සැම්පල් උත් මම දාලා පෙන්නුවානේ ලංකාවේ භාණ්ඩ මිල වැඩි වෙනවට වඩා අපේ රුපියක ඩිප්‍රීෂিয়েට් උනේ නැත්නම් අපිට මොකද වෙන්නේ කියලා. Right? So when Sri Lankan price levels are higher than US price level, and if Sri Lankan rupee does not depreciate as much as inflation rate, you see what are the consequences happening to the foreign reserves and things. And on the other way around, when the US price levels are higher than Sri Lankan price levels, if we are not appreciate Sri Lankan rupee against dollar, you also see what will happen to the inflation level after that. Right? So likewise, PPP is a realistic theory, but there are some occasions like compounding effect and non-substitute for traded goods. The PPP is not getting realistic as much as we expected. Okay, so that's the thing I want to highlight with the purchasing power parity realistic. Right. Now we are coming to the second point in arbitrage. Let me move back to the previous getting. Right. As far as we discuss about this inflation rate. Now we already finished. Now we are coming to the second point what we need to highlight regarding the determinants of exchange rate, that is relative interest rate. අපි මෙච්චර වෙලා කතා කරේ inflation rate එක ගැන. අපි දැන් කතා කරන්න යන්නේ interest rate differences ගැන. Right? So here we identified as an international Fisher effect. Right? What do you mean by international Fisher effect? That is, we use interest rate rather than inflation rate differences to explain why exchange rates are changed over time, right? But here we also need to identify that inflation is always close to the interest rate is very close to the inflation rates. හැම වෙලේම මතක තියාගන්න interest rate එක inflation එක හැම වෙලේම අපි අර කියන්නේ parallel යන්නේ. Right? So we know that the Fisher effect interest rate, normally we calculate nominal interest rate, right? By combining the expected inflation rate and real rate of interest. අපි තමයි nominal interest rate එකේ තියෙන ඔය දෙකනේ. Right? When we are calculating real interest rate, we remove the inflation difference from nominal interest rate. අපි ඔකනේ calculate Fisher effect එකේ. Okay? So අපි මෙතන අපි concern කරන්නේ nominal interest rate. We are considering but nominal interest rate. So here what we the theory suggests, right? Now Fisher effect suggest කරන්නේ nominal interest rate component දෙක. So Fisher effect suggests there are two components in nominal interest rate, that is expected inflation rate and real rate of interest. Right? So the Fisher effect, it suggests that the real interest rate is assumed to be same in the two countries. The difference in nominal rates between two countries is completely attributed to the difference in expected inflation rate between two countries. එතකොට සාමාන්‍යයෙන් රටක interest rate, real interest rate දෙක සමාන වෙනවා. Right? Nominal interest rate දෙක අතර තියෙන වෙනස සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම අපිට එලිමිනේට් කරන්න පුළුවන් වුණොත් inflation rates අතර වෙනස තුලින්. So that is what they call international Fisher effects. But what we are trying to do is not the international Fisher effects, right? We are trying to do is how interest rate differences are going to be influenced to the exchange rate determinants. Right? Now, let's look at this very brief example regarding how interest rate differences, here we call it as real interest rate and nominal interest rate differences, influence into the international market to make investments. අපි ඉස්සෙල්ලා මෙතන බලන්න interest rate වල difference එකක් ඇති වෙච්ච ගමන්, right? කොහොමද රටවල් අතර investment සිද්ධ වෙන්නේ කියලා. Okay, now look at this example. Assuming that real interest rate is 2% in Canada and also 2% in United States. That is why Fisher effect says the real interest rate assumed to be same. Okay, and then interest rate, that is risk-free interest rate mean nominal interest rate. Okay, so interest rate in Canada is 13% and 8% in USA. The nominal interest rate Canada is 13%, US is 8%. So since we are having real interest rates and nominal interest rate, then we can calculate the inflations in both countries. අපිට real interest rate එකයි nominal interest rate එකයි දීලා තියෙන ඉඳා අපිට inflation එක calculate කරන්න පුළුවන්. So we know that from nominal interest rate, if we reduce real interest rate, we will get the inflation rate. So expected inflation rate in Canada is now 11%, that is 13 minus 2, and inflation rate in United States is 6%. Now you can see the difference between expected inflation rate in two countries like 5%. Now Canada, it is 11% in inflation, and in USA it is 6% inflation. Now you know the Canada inflation rate is relatively high than US inflation rate. Right? So as a result, you can see Canada interest rate is also relatively higher than United States interest rate. So අපිට බලා ගන්න පුළුවන් හැම වෙලේම inflation එකක් ඇති වෙන හැම රටකම interest rate එක වැඩි. Right? So that is the monetary policies. Right? But in the last couple of years, what we can see in Sri Lanka, they try to they keep the interest rate low, right? But unfortunately, inflation rate is high, right? අර අපි කියන්නේ කකුල් දෙක දෙපැත්තට ගමන් කරේ ආර්ථිකය. එතකොට inflation එක වැඩි වෙනවා, interest rate එක අඩු වෙනවා. But that is not the best monetary policy. The monetary policy should be when the interest rate is high, when the inflation is high, interest rate has to be increased. Okay. Now, according to the international Fisher effect, what we can see is people can invest into the Canada market because it gets higher interest rate. Right? So normally in interest rate parity, what we can see like purchasing power parity, අපිට arbitrage වල දකින්න පුළුවන් වගේම interest arbitrage එකක් දකින්න පුළුවන්. ඒකේ මොකෝ වෙන්නේ? People can invest into Canadian investment by borrowing from US market. 108ක තියෙන US market එකෙන් ණයට අරගෙන 113ක් දෙන Canada market එකේ invest කරන්න පුළුවන්. Isn't it? Right? So that is we call interest arbitrage. What are we interest arbitrage? Like currency arbitrage, we know we buy currencies from cheaper market and selling into the higher market. So in interest arbitrage, what we can see is we borrow funds from low rate market, low interest rate market, and invest that borrowed money to high interest rate market. Okay. So since the expected inflation is 5% higher in Canada than United States, the Canadian dollar is expected to decline against dollar by 5%. Now we can hear is in Canada market, we have high inflation rate. That's why they are getting highest interest rate. Right? If United States investor, right? අපි තමයි ඇමරිකාවේ ඉන්වෙස්ටර් කෙනෙක් මේ interest rate දෙකේ වෙනස දිහා විතරක් බලලා he borrow fund from US market and invest into Canada market. Right? But what he forget completely is, since there is inflation, high inflation rate in Canada market, definitely Canadian dollar getting depreciate again US dollar. අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම Canadian dollar එක US dollar එකට සාපේක්ෂව අප්‍රමාණය වෙනවා. Okay, so US investor would earn 8% difference, that is 30% into 5%. Right? And අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම 108ක වැඩි interest එකක් ලබන්න පුළුවන් on the Canadian investment, which is same as they could earn in United States. Okay, what is this? Now look at the thing is now 30% interest rate is given in Canadian market, but remember the inflation difference is 5%. Now we have to be very concerned these two concepts. Now when the inflation rate is higher in Canada, mean the Canadian dollar definitely depreciate again US dollar. And Canadian dollar depreciate. Then when before people are ready to invest money to the Canadian market, right, it has to be forecast about what would happen to the Canadian dollar when the invest getting matured. අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම Canadian වල invest කරන්න කලින් US investor ට සිද්ධ වෙනවා සලකා බලන්න මොකද වෙන්නේ Canadian dollar එක මේ investment mature වෙනකොට. Remember that, right? That is the process we try to identify through interest arbitrage. ඔන්න ඔක තමයි අපි කතා කරන්නේ interest arbitrage තුල. Right? I hope you understand what is the main concern regarding interest rate differences. Right? If I summarize what we discussed, okay, now we can see there is a very significant interest difference between Canada and USA. Right? So interest arbitrage we identified as people borrowed from low interest rate market and invest them into high interest rate market. सामान्य interest arbitrage එකක් කියලා කියන්නේ low interest rate තියෙන market එකකින් මුදල් ණයට අරගෙන high interest rate එකක් ගෙවන market එකේ ආයෝජනය කරනවා. That is what Bangladesh investors are doing, because Sri Lankan interest rate is higher. So Bangladesh is doing is they invest into Sri Lankan investment. Right? So that completely give benefit to the Bangladesh investors. Right? But when we are trying to invest such a mechanism, first we need to know what is the inflation differences between two countries. Because inflation differences definitely reflect the depreciation and appreciation of domestic currency. Now, according to our situation, the Canadian inflation rates and US inflation rate difference is 5%, which is higher in Canadian market. The Canadian inflation rate is parking ready. Okay. Now, even the US investor getting 13% for a Canadian investment, he has to be careful with this 5% inflation rate, because this 5% inflation rate definitely depreciate Canadian dollar against US dollar by 5%. Right? Right? So the net interest earned should be 13 minus 5%. අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම net interest එක වෙන්නේ කීයද? 113 105 ගියාම 108යි. So this 8% is exactly similar to the 8% nominal interest rate in United States. So at that occasion, there is no interest arbitrage profit. එහෙම වුණොත් interest arbitrage profit එකක් මෙතන නැහැ. So excuse me. So that is the process we are going to identify through interest rate parity. ඕක තමයි අපි කතා කරන්නේ interest rate parity එක තුල. Right. So let's moving on to the brief summary in interest rate or Fisher effect. Now we can see relatively high local rate. There is a relative high expected inflation. Then there is a high inflation in local market. There is a domestic currency getting depreciate. Right? If there is a low interest rate in local market, finally domestic currency getting appreciate. But when there is no interest rate differences, there is no expected changes in exchange rate. Right? Now that is why I call you, even we are looking at the interest arbitrage or interest rate differences with the effect of exchange rate, we cannot forget about the inflation effect. Inflation effect එක අපිට අමතක කරන්න බෑ. Right. So implication of international Fisher effect. Right. So here again we have another example, right? Japan interest rate and US interest rate. Now you can see real interest rate getting equal. Then likewise our previous example, may example you have another example. Now based on the given interest rates, right? Now USA we have 8% interest rate, Japan we have 5% interest rate. Now we can see there is a high interest rate for USA compared to the Japan. But when we come into the inflation also, we can see US inflation is 6% and Japan inflation is 3%, since real interest rate is 2%. Real එක දෙකක් හින්දා අපිට අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම පේනවා USA වල 100ට 6යි inflation එක, Japan වල 100ට 3යි. Right? So according to the PPP theory, then Japan yen expect to be appreciated against US dollar by 3%. Since Japanese inflation rate is relatively lower than US inflation rate, we can expect that Japan yen has to be appreciated against US dollar. Right? අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම Japan yen එක appreciate වෙනවා US dollar වලට සාපේක්ෂව. Then when the people are trying to invest US market by borrowing funds from Japan market and invest into US market, has to be concerned about this appreciation of yen against US dollar. Though US interest rate is 3% higher, අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම 3% higher එකක් නේ තියෙන්නේ 8 to 5%. The Japanese investor will repurchase their yen at the end of investment period for 3% more than price which they sold yen. Right? Now yen is appreciate again dollar. yen එක ඩොලර් එකට සාපේක්ෂව appreciate වෙච්ච ගමන් මොකෝ වෙන්නේ? එයාට US ඩොලර් වලට හම්බෙන yen ගාන අඩු වෙනවා. Right? Therefore, their return from investment in United States is no better than what they would have earned domestically. Right? So now, assuming that Japan investor invests some amount to the US market, right? US investments, right? So at the maturity period over, like if it is a 3-month treasury bill, when the 3 months it is over, Japan investor getting principal plus interest or yield. Right? අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම මාස 3ක් ගියාට පස්සේ investment එකට principal එකයි interest එකත් එක්ක යාට හම්බ වෙනවා. But remember, since he invest in US market, he received his maturity at US dollar. When the 3 months is over, if Japan yen is appreciate again US dollar as we expected, අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම ඩොලර් එකට සාපේක්ෂව Japan yen එක appreciate වෙනවානේ. Why? Inflation rate is lower in Japan. As a result of that, Japan investor will receive less amount of yen for his dollar investment as a result of appreciation again dollar. ඩොලර් එකට සාපේක්ෂව yen එක appreciate වෙච්ච ගමන් මොකෝ වෙන්නේ? ඩොලර් එකකට ලැබෙන්න ඕන yen ගාන අඩු වෙනවා. එතකොට මෙයා US dollar වල ඉන්වෙස්ට් කරාට අවසානයේ එයාට මාස 3ක් අවසානයේ ලැබෙන yen ගාන අඩු නම් ඉන්වෙස්ට් කරන එකේ තේරුමක් නැහැ US market එකේ. So it is better them to invest in domestic market. This is what we are seeing through interest rate parity. Right? So interest rate parity emphasize us how interest rate differences give us benefit by comparing inflation as well as exchange rate, domestic currency appreciation or depreciation. එතකොට අපි interest arbitrage එකකට යනකොට අපිට එන benefit එක බලන්න වෙන්නේ exchange rate එකේ වැඩිවීම අඩුවීම එහෙම නැත්නම් domestic currency එකේ appreciation depreciation වෙන ප්‍රමාණය මත. Right? So we will discuss it in more detail, right? Looking at interest rate parity theory. Interest rate parity theory එකේ අපි ඔක කතා කරනවා විස්තරාත්මකව. So interest rate parity theory we look at how interest rate differences in two countries going to be influence the investment opportunities or arising the investment opportunities by considering exchange rate movements. By considering exchange rate movement. So we will discuss about interest rate parity in next session.